Welcome back to Battle for Normandy for the third round of Matrix Games Combat Mission Grand Tournament. This final battle is a dawn meeting engagement between US and German forces at an Autobahn Cloverleaf junction. Obviously, this makes the dominant feature on the map the Cloverleaf. We have roads coming in from north, south, east and west. The overpass in the middle, where they all overlap, has been smashed. The bridges are down and the area underneath is completely rubbled, making this area impassable for vehicles. On either side of this are the overpass ramps. The map is pretty flat, and these ramps constitute the only significant chunks of elevation, making them really important for blocking line of sight across the centre. Each leaf section of the cloverleaf has a little stand of trees in it, which also help to break sight lines up. The outer edge of the road network is lined by a low bocage. This is impassable to vehicles and infantry. There are some gaps and some small sections of hedge mixed in. Vehicles can plough through the hedge sections and infantry can hop over, but it can be very difficult to tell them apart from the low bocage. Obviously, you don't want to mix them up and spend the turn watching the TAC AI trying to drive itself to the nearest gap. So a good way to tell the difference is to press 7, 8 or 9 on your keyboard to get into one of the top-down camera positions. Looking down from above like this, hedges stand out because they're a lot thinner than low bocage. The roadnet also splits the map into quarters. Each quarter has some open grounds or fields along the roads, then some more dense terrain in the corner, and a feature of some description that constitutes an objective. Overall, the map is 832 by 784 meters, so not massive. Equally important to the physical terrain for this one is the fact that this battle takes place at dawn. The battle starts at 07:15 and there are 30 minutes on the clock. By 07:30, halfway in, the sun is up over the horizon. By the end of the battle, it will very definitely be light. So there's a period of darkness to begin with that offers risks and opportunities at the tactical level. The ground is dry, the weather is warm, there is some light wind coming up from the south, and there are 30 minutes on the clock. Big takeaway here though is that the terrain is broadly symmetrical. In a similar vein, the two competing sides here have symmetrical forces, a heavily reinforced and customized double company setup. At the top of the US force, we have a battalion HQ with its standard ops team, and then directly attached an 81mm mortar, a 50 caliber machine gun, a sniper team, and a forward observer, plus an M3 half-track for them to cruise about in. The first company is set up to be a kind of recon company. With the company HQ and XO team, we have another 81mm mortar, an M1919A4 medium machine gun, a bazooka team, 3 scout teams, another M3 half-track, and 2 M8 Greyhound armoured cars. The Greyhound is solid against light vehicles with the 37mm gun and pintle-mounted 50 cal. It's going to need to get around the sides or rear of Panzer IVs, but we can forgive it all day long because it has canister. The 1st and 2nd platoons of the Recon Company each just have 1 rifle squad, but they have a BAR team, 3 scout teams and 2 more Greyhounds attached to make up for it. The 3rd platoon has been turned into a kind of weapons platoon with a bazooka team, an 81mm mortar and another 50 caliber M2 team, plus a half-track. This initial force is split between 2 deployment zones. The battalion HQ elements and the Recon Company weapons platoon can deploy on either flank, everything else deploys in the centre. The 2nd company arrives after 5 minutes and is almost a straightforward US rifle company. 3 standard platoons, though the company HQ has an extra bazooka team and a half-track, and the 3rd platoon is backed up by a BAR team and 2 scout teams. After 10 minutes, the force's armoured support will arrive, 2 M10 tank destroyers and 4 M4A3 wet Shermans with the 75mm gun. Finally, the Americans have an off-map 2-tube section of 81mm mortars backing them up from the word go. The Germans have an equivalent organisation. Battalion HQ and support team at the top, with an attached 81mm mortar, HMG team, sniper team, forward observer and half-track. Then a 1st or Recon Company. The company HQ is backed up by a HMG, Panzerschreck 81mm mortar, 2 scout teams, a breach team, a half-track, a 234/2 armoured car, that's the Puma, and another 8-wheeled armoured car with a 20mm cannon, a 234/1. These two vehicles are broadly comparable to the Greyhound, though the Puma has a 50mm gun with a bit more punch to it, and the 20mm cannon obviously has a higher rate of fire. Then we have two recon platoons, each one coming with a rifle squad, a Panzerschreck and LMG team, two scout teams, a breach team, a Puma, and another 234/1. The third platoon is again configured as a weapons platoon with an 81mm mortar, a HMG and a Panzerschreck, plus a half-track. And, like the Americans, the battalion HQ and weapons platoon have deployment zones on the flanks. The other two platoons are deployable in the centre. The second rifle company is mostly out of the box, arriving out of 5 minutes. The HQ has an attached HMG, a Panzerschreck team and a half-track to ride around in. The rifle platoons only have one Panzerschreck, and the third platoon has a scout team, breach team and LMG team bolted on. Armoured support will pop in at the 10-minute mark, constituting 2 Jagdpanzer IVs and 4 Panzer IVs. Just to round it out, the force also has a 2-tube section of off-map 81mm mortars on call. So, we have mostly symmetrical terrain and broadly symmetrical forces. Now, we've got some symmetrical objectives. Both sides have the same core occupy objectives. The overpass worth 500 points, and then the north and south ramps, each worth 250. Just as a reminder, you get the points for occupy objectives if you're the only player that has troops in that area at the end of the game. Each side also has 2 touch objectives. You get the points for these when one of your units reaches the marked zone. The Americans get 100 points for reaching Overwatch Farm in the northeast corner, and 200 points for touching the lowlands in the southeast corner. The Germans get 200 points for touching the railway in the southwest, and the Overwatch hamlet in the northwest. So again, symmetry in the objectives. You get points for pushing into the far corners. Finally, both sides receive points for destroying enemy units in 3 categories. There are 200 points on offer for destroying recon units, which correspond to each player's first company starting force, another 200 for destroying troops, referring to the second company, turning up at the 5-minute mark, and then there are 300 points on the table for destroying the enemy armour, arriving after 10 minutes. These are incremental points. They accumulate as you blow stuff up and cause casualties. So, for example, because there are 6 tanks and tank destroyers on each side, knocking one out and wiping out the whole crew will net you 300 divided by 6 points, or 50. The result of this scenario's symmetrical design is that both sides have basically the same tactical options. There's not really any meaningful advantage to one side of the map or the other. The two forces are relatively balanced. The recce vehicles can all take each other on, but have limited utility against the heavier armour, at least from the front, while the tanks and tank destroyers can also penetrate each other without too much problem. In other words, 90% of the planning for one side will also apply to the other side. And because this is a meeting engagement, there are 2 basic options at the start of the game, both of which take into account the fact that both sides are moving to contact. We can push for the objectives straight away, or we can hold back, at least to start with. The more aggressive choice is to rush to control specific areas of the map before your opponent can. At the start, both sides are moving to position. Moving units are not only more visible, but have greater difficulty spotting themselves. So if you can get to good firing positions and go firm before the enemy, it's possible to gain a significant advantage. The key area that both sides really need to get a good grip on from the word go is their side's ramp leading up to the overpass. This slope gives you cover to your front towards the enemy and allows you to shoot out from behind it as the enemy enters your field of fire. It's a defilade position. From this central position, you can cover the north and south ramp objectives with fire, and it's very difficult for the enemy to deal with. To get line of sight for an engagement, they've got to enter the kill zone and take the risk of being engaged first. Note that this establishes fire control over those objectives rather than physical control. So although this is a really good position, it can only deny those objectives to the enemy. It can't seize them by itself. Obviously though, actually grabbing the ramp objectives is entirely possible at the start of the game if you're quick off the mark. With support from that central defilade position on either side of the overpass and using the darkness to get forward unspotted, you can rush in there and grab a toehold. If you can get there first, you can switch up the dynamics of the battle. It's technically a meeting engagement in which both sides are effectively attacking towards one another. If one side grabs the critical ground before the other and establishes a defense, the dynamic shifts to attack-defend. Attacking forces, generally, take more casualties and operate under greater pressures than defenders, which is a fancy way of saying that defense is easier than attack. So grabbing objectives or key terrain first and then defending them, forcing the enemy to attack you, is a good way to gain an advantage. Grabbing the north and south ramps first gives your opponent a dilemma. If they attack, they need to risk the loss of combat power that will leave them increasingly vulnerable as the battle progresses. But if they don't attack, then they're going to lose because you're sat on the objectives and are blocking the way to their touch objectives in the rear. It's always good to give your opponent a lose-lose situation. So this generates a pretty natural plan for both sides. With the recon company, get as far forward as you can, as fast as you can. Those Greyhounds and 234s are pretty damn quick on the roads. They can reach the ramps and the central defilade in short order, and you have some half-tracks to bring your infantry support along with them. Add in the darkness, and there's a good chance you can win the race to the objectives, especially against a cautious opponent. The more of the map you can establish control over, whether that's physical control or fire control, the harder you're going to make things for your opponent. Once your second company arrives after 5 minutes, you should have a good idea of the line of contact and where the enemy is, allowing you to determine where you want your infantry to go and what you want to do with them. The same applies to your armour after 10 minutes, though I would definitely focus on rapidly getting into positions where you can neutralise enemy armour. Those tanks and destroyers are not only worth a good chunk of points each if you can knock them out, but, as usual, winning the armour battle confers such a serious advantage that it usually results in victory. Alternatively, instead of taking important ground and provoking the enemy to attack you, the other option is to use that ground as bait. This is obviously riskier, but the intent is again to create a dynamic that favours you instead of your opponent by turning specific areas of ground into kill zones. For example, at the start of the game, it's a reasonable assumption that a competent opponent will try and get some armoured cars into that central defilade position. That's an area that is shielded from direct fire to begin with, but it's not got any overhead protection, and both sides start with off-map mortars on call. Greyhounds and 234s will not react well to direct mortar hits, and although the chances of a direct hit may be quite low, that's a risk that your opponent has to manage, as well as having to deal with vehicle commanders buttoning up and losing some spotting potential. In a similar vein, it's possible to lure the enemy into overextending onto one of the objectives and then decimate them with direct fire at the right moment. Although a sudden overwhelming fire ambush is more dramatic, longer engagements can also be beneficial if you are on the right side of the attrition gradient. If there is an extended fight over an objective where the enemy is feeding more and more combat power into the fight because you're threatening to take it, and you're taking fewer losses than they are, then you're in a good position. Providing, and this is the catch, you can bleed the enemy so much they can't stop you seizing that objective or others before the game ends. This is a less certain option than grabbing the ground yourself, especially because the central objectives likely to be candidates for this plan are worth more points than grinding the enemy down is. It's all about inflicting heavy attrition on the enemy to create conditions for successful action later in the battle. Managing to savage a platoon or two early on might be enough to tip the scales in your favour. Of course, you can apply these two basic plans simultaneously in different parts of the map. Grabbing ground and digging in on one flank, while you use the other flank as bait for a fire ambush, would let you essentially deny half the map while you concentrate forces on the other. That could allow you to hold the enemy off and punish them with one hand, while you punch through with the other onto a touch objective or into the enemy's centre. It's also important not to forget about the overpass objective here. It's worth the most points and is surprisingly accessible to infantry who can reach it. Inserting a few teams there early via half-track could create a very cost-effective payoff. If they're dug into the rubble and the approaches are covered by supporting fire, they're going to be difficult to remove. Finally, think it's worth talking about the darkness and all that low bocage around the road net. The darkness will ebb over time, meaning that as the game progresses, movement out in the open will become increasingly risky. The low bocage is an impassable obstacle for both infantry and vehicles, meaning that there are limited choke points where there are gaps or stretches of hedge in the bocage for either side to pass through. Combining these elements, we have a series of limited access routes that are much safer to use early and get more and more visible and more dangerous as the game goes on. Using the darkness to get into positions to cover those choke points may well give you the ability to punish the enemy as they move up when it gets light. Both sides do have the ability to blast holes in the bocage. Obviously the Germans have some breach teams, but the American scout teams also carry demo charges that they can use to make more paths. This has obvious side effects, not least the fact that it's kinda hard to miss a satchel charge going off, and blowing gaps in the bocage can clearly signal your intentions to the enemy, but it's an important capability to bear in mind and factor into your planning. So overall, this battle is another one that is difficult to call. With symmetrical forces, terrain and objectives, it's probably going to come down to the player with the better plan. So whatever you decide to do, plan it down to the last detail, building contingencies and options for everything you can think of. As usual, the results for ongoing tournaments are on the Matrix Games website, linked down below. Good luck if you've made it this far, hope this helps. If you're not playing, hopefully this was interesting. Either way, I'll catch you in the next video.